Momentum by Jerry Guern. The entire tribe knew, even before they joined tentacles around the speaking rock, what the chief was going to announce. There is very little lichen remaining on the home asteroid, and the garden rocks orbiting it were nearly bare as well. But the scouts had already found a pristine asteroid to the west, one with longer days, a surface squishing with lichen, and several deep caverns too narrow for predators to enter. During the next shadow, when the great planet above would block the sun's searing light and the pink-skinned pups could travel safely outside their mother's pouches, the tribe would make the crossing to their new home. Chick huddled in the shade of his mother's body, with one tentacle extended to the speaking rock. The black iron lump rang with every tap and scratch of the chief's talons, letting the entire tribe hear her at once, but lending her voice an eerie reverberance that distracted him from her words. But when she mentioned the planet, he leaned out from under his mother's side to look up reverently through the tangle of bodies and tentacles above him. He remembered the planet being nearly circular long ago, but it had gradually slimmed to a pale crescent, and it was so close beside the sun now that he had to position his eyes carefully at the edge of his shade to see it. Soon the planet would move in front of the sun for a time, even the elders could not say for how long, and the only lights to see by would be the stars and the fungus lanterns. The chief fell silent, and Chick quickly put his gaze back on her before anyone caught him daydreaming. She paused for a long time, her gray eye stalks downcast and her ragged speaking talon hovering above the black iron. "I am old," she finally tapped, slowly now. "Too old to lead a crossing, too old to bear pups, too old to fight predators. I will give myself to the fungus cavern soon. The tribe must choose a new chief before the crossing." Then she struck the speaking rock sharply, and Chick startled at the loud ring and pulled his tentacle away. All the gathered octos crouched low and retracted their eye stalks. His mother crouched too, right on top of him, forcing him down on his belly. The talons still on the speaking rock began to clatter against it rhythmically in shared agitation, so loud he could hear it through the ground. He looked around, bewildered and a little frightened by the display. He had seen this once before, when the tribe had gathered to grieve for old Set, but why were they keening now, when the sharks had not taken anyone? He reached cautiously for his mother's talon to ask, "Why are they sad?" But she slapped his tentacle away, so hard it stung like sunburn. Chick groped his way carefully along the craggy rock face, enjoying the solitude and the crunch of fresh ammonia under his talons. It was dangerous to be out here alone, and he'd be clubbed again if he were caught, but no one had paid him much mind since all the talk about the crossing. When he was as far out on his promontory as he could go without being spotted, he rolled onto his back and looked up into the starry sky and the glistening outer reaches of the planet's ring. Thousands of rocks orbiting the planet tumbled slowly past, a few large and close enough for him to see their features, most tiny in the distance but still sparkling with silicates and surface ice. Even the iron-black rocks hiding against the darkness of space glinted bright when the sunlight caught their jagged features. To the north and south, the procession of lights thinned, but down the ring's limbs to the east and west, the twinkling points merged into an effervescent haze that arced down to the horizon. Behind the haze lurked two herder moons, the smoky pink one and the brown dappled gray one, whose names he could never remembered. There were supposedly 5 herders, but he could only remember ever seeing one, an iron-black face laced with angry red cracks. But that herder and the 2 he'd never seen were far away now, watching over the ring's far side. He looked to where the ring disappeared over the eastern horizon, and he tried to imagine it extending outward, a circle so immense one could barely see it curve as it reached all the way around the planet. The elders said there were more tribes in the ring than he could ever count, some on home rock so far away he could travel his whole life and never reach them. With that thought, he rubbed his back affectionately against the rough surface under him. The elders talked sometimes about past home rocks, but this was the only one he had ever known, and he would miss it, particularly his promontory. It was far away from the cavern entrances, and its oblique jut created a wedge of all-day shadow in which he was safe from both the sunlight and from being spotted. He hoped the new home rock would offer him such refuge. A shape suddenly appeared on the horizon just where his gaze had been lingering. A young bull octo sailed upward, spinning rapidly, tentacles sprawled. Chick rolled onto his side to get a better view. The spinner pulled his tentacles in, making his rotation blurringly fast. 2 more young bulls appeared on the horizon on either side of him, arcing gracefully at the ends of their tethers. They converged on the spinner and caught him roughly in a tangle of tentacles, bringing all 3 of their bodies to an abrupt stop together. Then, operating in perfect unison, they flung their capture downward, pushing themselves upward into space, but only for a few tentacle links before they reached the limits of their tethers and bounced back down towards the surface, flailing their tentacles victoriously the whole way. "They are practicing," a voice clicked nearby, and hearing it through the porous rock under him startled Chick so badly that he flailed around clumsily trying to right himself. "Chief," he greeted her, tapping hard to be heard through the muffling rock. She looked different somehow, and he looked her over trying to gather how. She was gray and scarred in many places, with one drooping eye stalk, and she always looked tired, but, "I am not Chief any more," she said in a tempo of contentment. "Call me C.E.T. now." He blinked. It was such an odd, jagged, scraping name, and he had never heard anyone besides his mother call her by it. C.E.T., he enunciated, and she looked pleased at his pronouncing it correctly. But then she looked back to the cavorting bulls. "Their play is practice for maneuvering in open space. They will only be second-line fighters on this crossing, but someday they'll all have to scout, navigate, steer. You should be practicing too." He shrank a little. The young bulls of the tribe were only a season older than him, but their bodies were so stout and thick, gaining muscle before length, and they seemed to spend all of their days slinging small rocks at targets with bits of tether, bounding between the garden rocks, even linking together into flagella to sling each other around. And the more painful-looking the impacts, the more spastic their mirth. He had attempted to join their play just once. He found a group of 4 gamboling over a well-shaded valley, and he approached gingerly, trying to somehow slip into their games unnoticed. But before he noticed anyone noticing him, and before he could even plant his tether, a tentacle clenched painfully around his rear shoulder and flung him out into space. He threw his tether out without success and tumbled along, helpless and terrified, watching the ground recede farther away from him each time it spun through his view, until just before he would have reached the sunlight, a tether caught him and yanked him back down. He struck back first with terrible force and barely managed to catch the surface before he bounced off. Then, as he struggled to right himself, his tether came down over him and tangled in his flailing tentacles. The 4 bulls descended around him, convulsing in laughter. They pounded their tentacles against the ground, chanting, "Pink, pink, pink," as he pushed between them to scurry away, his tether dragging behind him. "They called me Pink," he answered C.E.T., "and they clubbed my hindquarters when they chased me away." Her face tightened, and with one talon she poked a dimple into the pliable brown skin of his back. "You are still pink a little, but it's not your fault. This tribe is weak. My tribe used to throw pup-pink younglings into the sun. They'd crawl back red and blistered, but most survived, and they'd be black and leathered before they were your age. You're—" But then he remembered what his mother had told him, that C.E.T. had come from the wild cannibal clans of the lower ring, who spoke mostly in gestures and who traded females with other tribes to prevent pouchmates from breeding. But he had never put the pieces together before now. Her name was so odd and difficult to pronounce because it was foreign. "This looks like a good place to be alone," she said, glancing around his promontory. "I never had any time alone when I was a chief. May we walk alone together?" He blinked again, a bit surprised at being asked permission by her, but he gestured welcome and offered to show her the rest of his promontory, at least the currently shaded part. As they loped together, he asked her several questions about her wild tribe, most of which she answered amid twitches of laughter, and she asked him some questions about how he spent his days, but there was little to tell. Eventually, he felt it was safe to ask her a question that had tugged at him since the gathering and the speaking rock. "Is the new home rock really better than this one?" "The scouts report that it is," she answered, and he realized she had not actually seen it. "My mother said that chiefs always say that," he answered, "before every crossing of every new home rock, even when it is not true, or else their tribe will not follow." She gave him a hard look and clenched her mouth like something in it tasted bad. "Your mother always had a bad spirit about her, even when she was a pup in my pouch." He had no answer to that. They walked a little farther down the side of the promontory to where there were still a few patches of wild lichen growing around a small cave. "C.E.T., why are you going to the fungus cavern instead of coming to the new home rock?" She fixed her gaze on the horizon. "It's the planet's way, youngling. Your mother should teach you about these things." He sensed she didn't want to discuss this, but "It was the planet's way in your old tribe," he said carefully, "not in this tribe." She stopped abruptly beside him and looked him over with narrowed eyes. "They do say that cleverness sometimes skips a generation. But even so, this tribe is weak. They have lost the planet's way, and all I can do is demonstrate it for them. I'm old and would only be a burden at the new home asteroid. Having to haul me along might jeopardize the crossing. But I'm a burden too, he said. The young very much are, she agreed. But someday you won't be. Someday you'll carry the tribe's other burdens. But I will only become more and more of one. And this tribe doesn't want any more of my wisdom as often as they've asked me for it. I will enjoy having some time here alone. He felt uneasy, both glad and regretting that he had asked his questions. But now he wanted to stop talking about such difficult things. He raised a tentacle and pointed to one of the orbiting garden rocks, a light brown lump high in the west. Are they going to bring lots of rocks to fend off the sharks? She looked where he was pointing. You mean the ones at the garden rock? They're just feeding on a whale carcass that drifted into the cave. They'll be gone before the crossing. He blinked. No, C.E.T. The whale is gone. She twitched. When? How do you know? The shark with the white scar took the whale away 2 days ago. There wasn't much left of her, just ribs and torn gas bladders. She squinted at the rock. Are you certain? I watched them all day. But the scouts say there are 2 sharks still lingering. Well, more than 2. Her eyes widened. She stooped down to him and took his 4 tentacles in hers. Check. I need you to think. How many other sharks have you seen near the garden rock since the one that took the whale away? He obeyed, picturing their individual faces in his mind, stamping 1 tentacle on the ground each time he remembered one. Oct and 2, he answered. But I think there are some others hiding in the cave because I see reflections of their flares. At first he didn't understand the expression on her face. He had never seen an adult's face frozen in fear. Check. Go to the cavern. Go to your mother. Stay there until I come for you. C.E.T., what is wrong? Go, she said, suddenly looking and sounding like the chief again. Now. Inside the home cavern, he found his mother asleep, wedged into a crevasse with her 2 new pups balled up beside her. He looked at them, envious of their company. 3 oct and 3 pups had been born to the tribe this season, and there were 2 oct and 4 younglings of the season before his. He had long sensed that the adults did not want to discuss the topic, but when all the females' bellies had begun to swell last season, he had finally worked up the nerve to ask, Mother, why are there no octos my age? Why is everyone older or younger than me? She had tried to pull her talon away, but he'd held on just long enough to finish his question. He feared she'd club him when he released her talon, but she only tucked her talons under herself and sulked for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she reached for his talon. Sad day, she clicked. Many sharks. He wedged himself into the crevasse, near her but not touching her, careful not to awaken the 2 pink obloids wrapped in her tentacles. He drifted to sleep and dreamed about tumbling helpless and terrified into the endless starry void. He was awakened by a tentacle on his face. C.E.T. pinched his talon between hers, quiet, and gestured for him to follow. Outside, the sun was halfway between the zenith and the horizon, and he had to maneuver carefully to remain in her shadow as she loped along, and he suspected this was intentional on her part. Several elders and scouts were gathered around the speaking rock, and they all turned to look as he and C.E.T. approached. Bulky Set traded places with C.E.T. to provide a larger shadow for him to stand in, and then Kay, who Czech gathered now was chief of the tribe, clanged his talons on the speaking rock to begin the discussion. They asked him first about how much time he spent watching the sky, and then about the sharks and the whale carcass. He withered a little at realizing his refuge was no longer a secret, but he answered their questions. Niket, an elder scout, listened intently but with a strangely suspicious expression. When Chick finished, Niket reported that he and his scouts had gone to the whale rock, approached as close as they safely could, and found that indeed there was no longer any sign of the whale, but several dormant sharks were hiding in the shallow cavern, while 2 sentries guarded the entrance. There were several alarmed reactions and expressions of disbelief before C.E.T. stated what he had thought was obvious. They're waiting for us to make the crossing. Sharks don't do that, someone blurted. No, said Niket, and several others clicked their agreement on the speaking rock. Sharks do not plan. They cannot think beyond their next meal. These sharks are just roosting here for some reason. Sharks can learn just like we do, C.E.T. responded. If they can recognize weak or injured creatures, they can see that we are running out of lichen. They might even have learned that tribes with young migrate during shadows. That generated some heated discussion, most of which Czech couldn't follow with so many talons clicking at once, but Chief Ke soon called them back to order. Whatever the reasons for the sharks lingering here, they endanger our crossing, said elderly Hektek. We should send envoys to the whale rider clans to barter for their help. Their price will be high, but better our young females go to them than to the sharks. Czech drew himself up in excitement, picturing himself clinging like a barnacle to the side of a majestic monster the size of a garden rock, propelled by explosions of flaming gas from deep within that vast, cavernous body. But then he saw that several elders, including Seeti, were flicking their tentacles dismissively. The whale riders, it seemed, traveled the faster orbiting lower reaches of the ring, and the last clan that had passed would be many octaves away by now. Brawny Set then spoke up, to suggest that the tribe make the crossing immediately, without waiting for the shadow. Our slingers can fight the sharks best in the light. The pups can travel in pouches, and if they slow the carriers down too much, we will have to abandon them. Curse the sharks and the planet for forcing us to make such choices, but better to lose some of our pups than the whole tribe. Czech found himself inching away from Set, to the other side of his spacious shadow. To his astonishment, he saw that Seeti was gesturing her agreement with the plan. But Chief Ke responded first. We will not abandon any pups, not one. Sacrifices are necessary at times, but our tribe will not survive losing so many again. We will cross when they can cross safely, and we will protect them to the last of us. Seeti and Set moved to respond, but the chief flicked his talon loudly against the speaking rock. His decision was final. Others spoke in turn. Iti waxed poetic about octotribes growing in number, spreading too quickly, leaving too many asteroids bare before moving carelessly on, and about the planet acting to restore balance to protect her other children. But Seeti pointed out that if the planet were truly out to cull the tribe needn't worry about appeasing the planet. Ut offered to lead an all-out attack on the Shark Haven, but when he was pressed, he admitted he'd gotten no volunteers. Czech kept quiet through the discussion, uncertain if they'd forgotten he was there. After everyone had had a chance to speak, Niket somberly drew himself up again. I'd hoped someone else would say what is obvious so that I would not have to, he said. Then he fixed his gaze on Czech. Last season, the sharks took all of our pups, and they left us just one. And that pup seems to spend all of his time staring at the sky, watching the sharks. I don't know the reason for such an affinity. E.T. is wiser on such things than I am. But it is clear to me that these sharks are here to claim what they missed before. What backwards nonsense, C.T. clanged against the speaking rock. This sounds like something my birth tribe would conclude. But the chief raised his tentacle to her, and she fell quiet again. E.T., meanwhile, had perked up with great interest, and several questioning gazes fixed on Czech. He edged farther away until he felt sunlight touch his hindquarters. Then Set put a thick tentacle around his back, and he froze, uncertain if the tentacle was for reassurance or capture. What are you suggesting we do, Niket? Said Chief K. Niket faltered. He pulled his tentacle away and put it back on the speaking rock several times before he managed to speak. K, do you remember the crossing we made when you were a pup? Seeti, Iti, Oot, you were all there. We don't talk about that crossing often, do we? And when the steerers realized that we were the three elders he named bristled. This is not the same as that, said Seeti. Isn't it? We realized we were going to drift right past our new home rock into the void, with no more big rocks near to anchor on and no more ballast rocks to throw. Isn't it strange how we don't tell the young ones this story, even when we lecture them about sacrifice for the good of the tribe? We grabbed old Surat. We slung him out into space with all our strength. He gave us just enough recoil to push us close enough to get the tether on the new home rock. The whole tribe survived, at the cost of, "This is not the same!" Niket pressed on. You and Set were ready just a moment ago to set out immediately and abandon any pups that slowed us down. And now you balk at sacrificing one weak, idle sky starer? Kay, isn't it worth trying to appease these sharks, when even if I'm wrong it will cost us so little? Czech trembled. What frightened him the most somehow was that no one was even looking at him. Chief K looked very grave. Niket, when I said that we would not survive losing pups again, I did not mean just survival of our bodies. We cannot. If you're too squeamish, Niket answered. I'll take him right now. I will do what. Suddenly Chief K lunged, and everyone shrunk away, startled. Perched atop the speaking rock, he loomed over Niket, who tried to keep his eye contact even as he backed away. Then his eye stalks fell, and he tucked his tentacles under his body submissively. After a moment, K returned to his spot on the ground. We will leave at the onset of the shadow. We will fight off the sharks as we do when they approach our cavern. And to the very last of our number, we will protect the pups, including this idle youngling, without whom we wouldn't even know about this danger. And indeed, if it is true that the planet has sent the sharks to cull us, then we needn't worry about appeasing her or them. Anyone who will not abide by my decision may challenge me for the chiefhood. The sun loomed high over the horizon, and when Czech positioned himself to block it with the point of an outcropping, he could just make out the wispy limbs of the planet's dayside crescent projecting from the glare like a pair of horns. The entire tribe had gathered on the west slope of a peak on the equator, where the home rock's spin combined with a running jump would send even the feeblest octo sailing into space. Throwers were positioned on the peak, ready to help the jumpers gain as much speed as possible. Weavers were carrying fungus lanterns wrapped in tether bags up from the caverns, and every adult not encumbered with pups or lanterns had their pouches half full of big ballast rocks or jagged chipped slinging rocks. Scouts had set out the day before to set out caches of slinging rocks along the path of the crossing. Czech had heard his whole life about the drumming, dancing, rutting, and cavorting that filled the hours before a shadow, but today the tribe was nervous and somber as they shuffled into their positions. The hard ground of the slope reverberated with anxious chatter, nearly all of it about sharks, sharks, sharks. One mother, whose swollen pouch writhed with 2 swimming obloids, and whose eye stalks sagged like she'd not slept in days, grabbed his talon and begged him to tell the sharks to spare her pups this time. Some other females intervened and pulled her away, including his own mother, who barely looked at him. Niket gave Czech long, suspicious looks, but mostly kept his attention on his preparations with the other scouts for the crossing. CET was nowhere to be found. The visible remnants of the planet disappeared slowly into the glare of the sun. At some point he realized that the glare itself was less bright than normal, as if an ice cloud or a plankton bloom were passing in front of it. But this dimness was steady and lingering. He reached out from his shade and tested the light with the tip of a tentacle. The burn was but slight. Soon after, he finally stepped out of his shade and joined the throng of octos milling about in the twilight. And then in the span of a few heartbeats, everything went from twilight to black. Tentacles pounded against the ground as day became darker than night. When their eyes adjusted, the planet became visible again, a filmy crescent where some sunlight still oozed through the translucent upper atmosphere. But soon even that contracted into a smudge, then dimmed and vanished. No longer drowned out by sunlight, the faintly luminous features of the planet's night side began to emerge. Storms that looked so deadly and wrathful in the daylight were visible here only by the soft green wisps they stirred, flows of luminescent plankton that had been captured and somehow adapted to that churning, caustic atmosphere. When their eyes adjusted fully, the planet's entire night side iridesced with murky wisps and shimmers, speckled with silhouettes of rocks and ice balls of the lower ring. A series of clangs reverberated through the ground, and everyone turned to see Chief K striking a lump of iron against the slope. On that signal, the crossing began. It seemed so strange to Czech, discordant somehow, that it took such a short span of time for his home, the entire world he had ever known, to become an uninhabited rock shrinking away in the distance behind him. Several males carrying ballast rocks almost as heavy as themselves led the charge of the peak, and the rest of the tribe followed behind them as fast as the throwers could help them launch. The pups were handed over to stronger carriers, and special care was taken with the females who were not practiced at being launched. Czech approached the runway ready to charge with all of his strength, well aware that he'd be trampled by the fighters behind him if he didn't keep up. But then he wilted with relief when Set picked him up and draped him across his chest. He only had to cling tight and endure the crushing acceleration of the sprint, then the doubled acceleration of the throw. And suddenly he was in space. He let go of Set and maneuvered aside without having to be told to. For several heartbeats, he just drifted along, touching nothing, with no tether and no feeling of motion at all, surprised by his own feeling of tranquility. The tribe quickly formed up, first catching each other's free tentacles, then pushing themselves outward as widely as possible, an enormous living net like that of a castor bird, spreading out to capture those who had launched a bit off course or a bit too slow. Only the last throwers bringing up the rear had to use their tethers to catch up. When the net was finally complete, everyone pulled their tentacles in and the net contracted. Then began the clambering over one another into assigned positions. Pups were handed off to the least capable fighters. Steers went to the front and began reading the stars, and the woven bags of slinging rocks were passed to the fighters. Czech went to his spot behind Chief K and between two fighters, and they took his tentacles securely in theirs. Elder E.T. was behind him holding a pup, but he was not long enough to offer his rear tentacles to her. "Your task during the crossing will be to do what it seems you are best at," the chief had told him. "You will watch, and you will report to me what you see." He searched the starry darkness until he spotted two swaying fungus lanterns. The tribe's path actually took them closer to the shark's haven before it took them away, so two pairs of sentries had been posted where they could watch the haven from a safe distance. The motion of their lanterns was a repeating report of, "All clear, all clear, all clear." In the distance beyond the lanterns, he saw a magnificent but jarring sight. The sparkling haze of the ring's western limb, with no horizon to block it, reached farther out than he had ever seen before. But the portion above him was simply gone, lopped off by the planet's shadow. At the terminator, he could see the distant individual specks of it, sunlit rocks and ice balls, dimming and disappearing as they tumbled into the darkness. Soon the tribe neared one of the old garden rocks they'd eaten bare long ago, which the scouts had marked with a fungus lantern. The steerers at the corner of the net began gesturing elaborately to one another, and Czech watched them in fascination, suddenly seeing the great value in space of the old languages, which in turn made him think again of Cieti, alone back on the home rock. The steerers had meanwhile come to a decision and scrambled into action. On their leader's signal, they braced themselves against the bodies around them and flung one of their number outward at astonishing speed, forward into the left of the tribe's path. The entire net recoiled back into the right, though after Czech thought about it, he realized the feeling of being pushed back was just the net being slowed slightly. He and the young bulls watched in amazement as the flung steerer careened by the garden rock, threw his tether as he passed, swung around the back of it, and came sailing back to the net even faster than he launched. The other steerers moved in haste to throw several tethers for him, and the whole net lurched to the right a second time when they caught him. The lead steerer quickly went back to reading the stars to ascertain if the course correction had been successful. "Perhaps you will be a navigator someday," Chief K clicked to him, and Czech liked that thought very much, almost as much as he liked the chief acknowledging him. He looked again at the garden rock and began retracing the steerer's trajectory on the maneuver. But as he turned back to check the signal lanterns again, he glimpsed something in the periphery of his vision, a shimmer of orange. As quickly as he recognized the glint off black iron, he looked in the direction it must have reflected from, and barely caught the last flicker of a flare. Then a star winked out on the same spot, blocked by a passing shape. "Shark!" he clicked to the chief and the fighters beside him. But they looked towards the sentry's lantern before they looked where he was frantically pointing, and then they couldn't see anything. "Look at the silhouettes," he clicked. But at least the alarm he raised propagated quickly across the net, and the tribe responded to the danger they couldn't see yet. Tentacles flexed and drew the net in defensively. Fighters readied their slings and jagged rocks. Czech could only keep watching the stars for shadows. They went far around our sentries, he realized, and they knew not to use their flares until... A sudden gout of flame blinded them all, even though it was pointed away from them. The shark appeared, a black silhouette against its own flare, surging towards them. All around the net, tentacles lashed out, slinging jagged rocks with cruel speed and precision. But the shark just careened through the punishment with its vulnerable eyes closed tight, straight into the center of the net. Czech released the tentacles he was holding, as he'd been taught. Indeed, the entire tribe disconnected, letting the predator pass through instead of pushing the net off course. 2 adults were knocked aside and had to throw their tethers back. But a young bull who had been hit square held on, digging talons into the shark's already wounded flank and face. The creature broke through the net, thrashing and snapping, but unable to dislodge the unexpected attacker or to get at the tentacles wrapped near its mouth. As the net reformed, the whole tribe watched in stunned admiration at the bull's sacrifice, flailing their free tentacles in salute, all except Czech. They knew to go far around our sentries, he thought, glancing quickly around in the now many possible directions of attack. They planned this out. This one was trying to push us in that direction. It must have been just then that the bull's long talons finally found the shark's tight-shut eyes, because in the periphery of his vision, Czech saw the shark's body shudder and clench up, and he knew what would happen in the next instant. While the rest of the tribe took in the satisfying but blinding sight of the shark blasting away in pain and panic, Czech shielded his eyes, forcing them to remain open, and looked out into the dark void to see what the light might reveal there. Faces, 6 of them, approaching fast. It was the first time he'd ever seen sharks face on, mouths gaping full of teeth, tiny black eyes glistening as they oriented on him. Again he clicked frantically, "More coming!" on the tentacles he was holding. The others were still flare-blind, but a heartbeat later eye stalks oriented on him to see where he was pointing. The net disconnected, and the fighters began slinging their sharp, jagged rocks at the incoming attackers. Where the first shark, the diversion, had endured the lacerations and plunged through, the mixed pack writhed and veered and flared as soon as the pain began. They thought we'd all be blinded. Despite their attempt to veer, 3 sharks still crashed through the disconnected net, turning everything to chaos. The first knocked a steerer on the flanks aside and sent him spinning into the void. The second emerged on the other side of the net, with Set hanging from its mouth, and quickly flung him aside, broken before he could dig in any talons. The third hit just forward of the center, hurtling sideways as it struggled to maneuver. Its long body slammed into several fighters, who held on, clubbed it ferociously, and tore into its face. But the impact against so many bodies had brought the massive beast to a stop, and its ponderous tail flopped aside to point directly down the middle of the net. The whole center scrambled to pull one another aside while shielding their eyes. Peeking up from behind Chief Ke, Czech saw the shark go rigid, and all he had time to do was duck and put his face against Ke's back. And then everything turned into heat and light. Wisps of hot gas poured all around him and into the space between himself and Ke. The searing heat lasted only a heartbeat until the gas dissipated, but the burn of oxygen lingered on his hide and eyelids. He had never felt oxygen before, only seen the blistering burns on creatures that had disturbed clouds of plankton, but there was no mistaking what this was. The horrific substance corroded flesh like pupskin in sunlight, and when it exploded in mixture with methane, the unburned traces became wickedly caustic. Czech opened his eyes as quickly as he dared, but his lids and stalks resisted, and what little he could see was dim and smeared. After a few blinks, he could see cracks and blisters on his foretentacles, but at least that meant his vision was clearing. There were slight burns on Ke's back, but the flesh of his dorsal ridge had burst open, and his foretentacles were clenched over his face as others converged on him. The shark was gone, and the net was in complete disarray, scattered into several clumps of octos reaching out to reconnect. Someone opened a woven bag and started setting out fungus lanterns, as there was no longer any point in trying to hide in the dark. The sharks must have realized the same thing, because several flares blazed in the distance as they circled around for another pass. Czech positioned himself higher behind Ke, keeping one eye on the sharks and the other on the females examining Ke. They clicked his talons and he responded, but when they managed to get his tentacles away from his face, there was fear and grief on their faces. Then Niket hurried over, also watching the distant sharks as he clambered across the still reforming net. Czech drew away fearfully, but then he realized that Niket hadn't spotted him, and his attention was wholly on Ke. One of the females pushed Ke's limp tentacle to Niket. They clicked to each other but briefly. Then Ke felt his way up Niket's tentacle, shoulder, neck. Niket drew himself up so that the whole tribe could see as the chief stroked a circle on the crown of his head. All around the net, fighters watching with their slings at the ready saluted their newly appointed battle chief, and then returned their attention to the sky and the sharks. Then Czech looked at Niket again, and saw Niket glaring back at him, eyes full of hate. He threw himself blindly backward across the top of the net, with no time to think of exactly where he might find refuge from a battle chief. Then he had a panicked inspiration to dive between the bodies through the mesh of the net. He reached, but the tentacles of an attacking adult were too fast to flee from. One clenched powerfully around his rear tentacles and yanked him backwards. He flailed and grasped for anything solid, but the others were just out of reach. With pain radiating across his body, he desperately clicked, "Please, Niket, no!" on the thick tentacles cutting deep into his hindquarters. But Niket reeled back and flung him so hard he felt things tearing in his rear shoulders. And then he was hurtling through space again, facing backwards, watching his tribe recede rapidly away from him. He never even saw the shark he was meant to appease, the gaping mouth that Niket had thrown him to. And Niket didn't even linger to watch if his gift was successful, but turned his attention presently to the fighters and clambered to the front of the net to direct them. Czech tried to pivot around, to at least go out fighting, to slash at the monster as its teeth tore into him. But he only managed to turn in time to see the long, dark, sinuous body wind aside to avoid him. Then the blunt tail whipped around to complete the maneuver and caught the side of his head, and white starbursts filled his vision. When he could see again, his head throbbed and the stars were spinning slowly past. He spread his tentacles out as wide as they'd go to slow his spin and looked around to get his bearings. But without the sunlight on the ring, there were only stars to see or to see by. Finally, after a long search of the endless sky all around him, he saw the green fungus lanterns in the distance, a little swarm of them, and then, all around the fungus lanterns, shark flares. Niket saved me, he thought. Not intentionally, but he saved me. Then he looked around himself again, and for the first time in his life he understood why adults sometimes laughed dryly at bleak news. I'm saved! There was nothing around him, nothing even to throw his tether towards. He was adrift in the void, the nightmare, the dire fate that adults warn younglings about. Without so much as a ballast rock to throw, he could do nothing but drift forever, until he encountered something by chance, or until the sharks came, or until he starved. He closed his eyes and tried to still himself as real fear began to grip him. His tentacles were still stretched all the way out, but touching nothing. It had never occurred to him before what a comfort he'd taken for granted, the feeling of rock under his tentacles, or even the slight tug of a tether holding him to something, anything. If I drift long enough, surely I'll find a rock, get close to something to throw my tether. But then what? Starve on a rock? But then it occurred to him, it was unlikely he'd starve to death, either adrift in the void or on a bare rock, because the shadow would pass well before then, and the sun would burn him to death. It wouldn't be quick like it would be for a pup, because his hide was fairly brown, but it would be quicker and less painful than starvation. I need to calm myself, he thought, as he felt panic welling up within him. Panic wouldn't help anything, even if there was nothing to do. However long it would take for him to starve, or for the shadow to pass, it would be best to pass the time in peaceful thoughts. He opened his eyes and did what he loved most to do, look up at the endless, dazzling sky. As he calmed himself and his body relaxed, he started to feel his burns again. His tentacles were quite blistered now, and the pain lanced through him whenever he moved them or his face. So he simply stopped moving, let his body be slack, let his tentacles curl into his abdomen, like the dead's when they were being carried to the fungus caverns. The pain was not so great if he didn't move, and his fear was not so great if he just quieted his mind completely. Eventually, his pain and fear gave way to simple exhaustion, and he fell asleep. He awakened with a wince as something snagged his blistered foretentacle. The tether was thin and frayed, seemingly near its breaking point, and it was flowing quickly past him, pulled along westward by some small throwing weight that he couldn't see in the distance. As he seized the tether and began coiling it around an unburnt tentacle, he felt the throwing weight come up short and pull back towards him. Soon he had the rock and that end of the tether tucked under his tentacle, and he could feel the thrower pulling back on the other end. Finally, in the distance, he saw an octo. He thought hopefully of the ones that had been knocked aside by the sharks early on, of the sentries posted at the shark haven, and then more darkly of Niket. But eventually he recognized, in utter disbelief, the gray-splotched hide and crooked tentacles drawing near him, and she was carrying a ballast rock wrapped in her rear tentacles. Quickly consuming her used tether as she approached, CET gave him what was clearly a gesture of command, but he didn't understand it. But he was at least able to gesture back that he didn't understand. She scowled, and the instant she was close enough she grabbed his burned shoulders. Wincing in pain, he reached for her talon to speak, but she clenched his talon silent and clicked, "No time to talk. We need to maneuver quickly." He followed her lead. Still astonished by the very sight of her, he tucked himself under her belly so that her tentacles reached around his and pointed in the same direction. He discovered in the course of their coordinating that while she was larger than him, in her old age she was not much stronger. Throw straight, as hard as you can, on my signal, just barely above that little red nebula. They flung the ballast rock together, and it sailed in approximately the direction she specified, while the two of them were pushed straight backward. When the maneuver was finished, they did not immediately disengage. He leaned back into her soft belly, not minding the slight friction against his burned back. And she meshed her tentacles through his, held him close, and rubbed her face against the top of his head. "How did you get here?" he clicked. "I set out yesterday," she answered. "I saw the sharks ignoring the sentries and figured they'd ignore me too. I saw everything from that garden rock the steerer pushed off." Did anyone else survive?" "None who were on the net. The sentries are gone too. They joined the fight as soon as they realized the sharks had gone around them. Do you know if Kay sent any forward scouts? Did the ones who set out the rock hashes come back to travel with the net?" "I don't know." They were quiet for a long time, coasting along together, holding each other, grieving. "Grandmother, where are we going?" "The closest asteroid I can get us to without going back through the sharks. It's another of our old garden rocks. It has a small cavern we can rest in." She pulled back from him a little so she could retrieve something from her pouch. "But there's no lichen left there, and you need to eat to heal those burns." She put the object into his talons, and he recoiled, staring in horror. "CET, I can't eat this." "You must and you will. We're alone out here. We won't survive unless we do whatever it takes. No more being weak. We're going back to the old ways of my birth tribe. Eat." Whose is it?" "It's better you don't know. My tribe used to say, your friends would want you to live, your enemies will taste like revenge. Eat." He fidgeted with the thick tentacle in his talons, trying not to look close enough to recognize anyone's markings on it. His gaze drifted over to the severed ends, which bore two neat parallel cuts from shark teeth. "Jack, you have to survive. You have to. I'm going to do my best with you, teach you all I can for as long as I can. But you need to reach the other tribes. You need to tell them what happened here. Sharks have never done any of this before. They don't wait for prey. They don't hunt in packs. They don't attack in formation. The one that Niket threw you to didn't even break formation when food was in front of its mouth. Something very sinister has happened, and it's not over. The other tribes need to be warned, or they won't survive any better than ours did. So you need to eat." It took him some time to resign himself to it, to disobey the ingrained inhibition. It was difficult cutting through the sinewy flesh with his talons, but finally he tore a large fibrous piece free, forced his mouth slit open, and drew it into his belly. Amid all the exertions and grief of this day, he had not even realized how hungry he was. It was not until he was nearly finished with the tentacle that he thought to offer a piece to CET so that they could eat together as tribe. She accepted only a token ceremonial piece. "CET, is that where we're going?" he asked sometime later, pointing. She squinted in the distance. "Yes, but we're going to miss it by quite a ways. Our throw was off. You're going to have to throw your tether to it." "I can't, it's too far. Even the fighters couldn't." "I know." She took him by the shoulders, turned him around, and oriented him. Then one by one, she took the tip of each of his tentacles into hers. His eyes widened when he realized what she was planning. When she was in position, she stuck a new tether to his chest, just above his mouth. "I will take care of aiming you," she said. "When I nod, push off as hard as you can. I'll get you as close as I can to that rock, but it will still be a long throw. When you get your tether on it, tug mine so that I know, then you can start pulling me to you. Ready?" "Wait, you should do the throwing. You know how—" "No more being weak," she cut him off. "No more. You need to learn, and if you can't learn, we will die. That is the planet's way. So are you ready to go catch that rock and save our lives?" He did not feel ready, but he knew the right answer. "Ready." She looked at him approvingly. Then she braced herself, squinted to look in the distance over his shoulders again, and nodded. They pushed off each other with all their strength, and she sailed away into the starry distance, trailing her tether behind her as he sailed backwards toward the garden rock. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed my story as much as I enjoyed reading it to you. This is my first video I've ever posted on YouTube, but I might post other stories like this farther down the road. That'll depend on the response I get from this one. If you would like to be alerted when those come out, hit subscribe and click the notification bell. And also, I'd appreciate it if you would click like on this video. And if you are impatient for more of my stories and would like to read some, you can click the Amazon link in the description below to see my short story collection, Purple Dreams. And then you can click the preview button to read my story, Dreaming. And if you've already read Purple Dreams, please let me know in the comments which of the stories you like best. I would love to hear from you. Take care, everyone. Thanks again, and watch out for sharks.